Camilla, whoever Tommy Robinson is, whatever Elon Musk is demanding, at the centre of part of this story is an issue of such significance. You cannot overestimate it. And this is the issue of, well, grooming gangs. But as you say, we are talking about child rape and prostitution facilitated, well, perpetrated by many, many men across different cities in the UK. Many of those men Pakistani origin, but also the exploitation and the trafficking of girls between different people. Absolutely horrific details. I'm sure a lot of people won't be completely across the many, many years that this story has been being covered, but also the many years that it went uncovered by journalists and others. So let's go through a few details of how we got here.
So basically, Kamal, so far we've had an investigation. We have the 2014 report by Professor Alexis Jay into what had happened in the South Yorkshire town of Rotherham. The conclusion of that report was that around 1,400 children had been targeted by grooming gangs there between 1997 and 2013, and some of the victims were as young as 11. We then, in Rochdale, quite close by, had two whistleblowers come forward, one of them the former Greater Manchester police detective Maggie Oliver, and the other a social worker called Sarah Rowbottom, both warning that agencies had turned a blind eye to the grooming that had gone on in that town because the perpetrators were predominantly Pakistani, and there were concerns in the police force, in the local community, among local councillors, even among social workers, that if you blew the whistle on this, that it would look as if you were being racist, that it would harm community cohesion. We had a report in the Telegraph, and I do urge you to read this. It's by Sam Ashworth-Hayes and Charlie Peters of GB News, detailing the whole scandal from start to finish, and really bizarre things that happened while some of these crimes were being investigated. For instance, the victims themselves being treated as if they were the criminals, young girls basically being accused of bringing it on themselves. We had another situation where a couple of dads went to knock on the doors of abusers to try and rescue their daughters. The police then go and investigate the dads, lock them up and not the abusers. We even had a case, Kamal, where a social worker ends up attending a wedding between a teenage girl and her Asian abuser, not calling out the abuse. So the whole thing is a minefield.
Absolutely astonishing. Not only this weird and completely wrong-headed fear of racism, allegations of racism being the thing that anybody should be speaking about with such horrific evidence before them, but also that victims simply weren't listened to. So I think there's one side which is the fear of racism supposedly about Asian men, but on the other side, working class young women, many of them who had been in care or were in care, just simply not being believed. And again, somehow they were at fault. We've talked about this before in child abuse cases that we've discussed on this podcast, that the victim is somehow, if it's a young woman, particularly, from a certain background or in care, somehow they're asking for it in some way. So it's such a mixture of horrors here. After those whistleblowers came forward and investigations done, as you say, by investigative journalists, there was then a report in 2024 on child sex exploitation in Rochdale between 2004 and 2013. And that did indeed find that there was compelling evidence of widespread abuse and that Greater Manchester Police and Rochdale Council had failed to properly investigate these cases, leaving many, many girls at the mercy of their abusers. And if we just look in January 2024, a total of 42 men had now been convicted, which had resulted in jail sentences totaling 432 years. 47 girls in this case were identified as victims of child sexual exploitation during the initial police investigation. But we know that this behaviour had probably been going back decades
Yeah.
into the 80s and 1990s.
Also, The Telegraph has written an extraordinary story suggesting that two of the abusers in Rochdale, who were stripped of their British citizenship by Theresa May 9 years ago, are still living among the victims that they abused and can't be removed because they've launched a legal case, saying they can't be sent back to Pakistan because of their human rights. And Pakistan are saying we don't want them back anyway. So we're in a kind of stalemate where justice is literally physically being seen not to be being done in Rochdale. We then have the Oldham situation, which is what's brought this all back to light, Kamal, because in Oldham, Jess Phillips has been pressured to come up with a public inquiry that goes beyond the remit of just Oldham and indeed Rochdale and indeed Rotherham and looks at the entire picture across the UK, even though I think this has predominantly occurred in northern towns. And she's resisted it.
And then from Jess Phillips, it's a few short strides to Keir Starmer, because whilst a lot of these issues were going on and lack of investigation, Starmer ran the Crown Prosecution Service between 2008 and 2013. And that's where Musk leant in so aggressively and said, on X, Starmer must go and he must face charges for his complicity in the worst mass crime in the history of Britain. And this criticism stems from a case that was investigated in 2009 when a decision was taken by the CPS not to prosecute alleged perpetrators in that Rochdale case that we've given detail of. Lawyers believed the victim would not come across as reliable or credible. Now, Starmer had been Director of Public Prosecutions for 9 months when that decision was taken. There is no evidence that we have seen, Camilla, is there, that he was made aware of any of the details of the case. And then actually, the case was then reopened in 2011 when the new chief prosecutor for the northwest of England, a guy by the name of Nazir Afzal, he overturned that 2009 decision and said that actually there should be prosecutions of people connected to that case.
Shall we hear from Starmer himself, because he has addressed this criticism that he did not do enough as the Director of Public Prosecutions to protect these teenage victims?
And they've not been listened to and they've not been heard. And when I was Chief Prosecutor for 5 years, I tackled that head on because I could see what was happening. And that's why I reopened cases that had been closed and supposedly finished. I brought the first major prosecution of an Asian grooming gang. In the particular case, it was in Rochdale, but it was the first of its kind. There were many that then followed that format. I changed the whole prosecution approach because I wanted to challenge and did challenge the myths and stereotypes that were stopping those victims being heard. So we changed the entire approach, not without criticism at the time, I might add. And when I left office, we had the highest number of child sexual abuse cases being prosecuted on record. Now, that record is not secret. As a public servant, it's there for all of you or everybody to see. I also called for mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. I called for that a decade ago. The Tories did nothing about that for those 10 long years, including when the J report came out nearly 3 years ago now. Central plank, mandatory reporting, still hasn't been done. We're going to do it.
And Elon Musk has just doubled down again in the last few minutes. He's tweeted, Starmer was deeply complicit in the mass rapes in exchange for votes. That's what the inquiry would show.
Trouble is with that is that, I mean, I can understand it. Elon Musk seems to want Keir Starmer to be held accountable because he doesn't agree with him politically and clearly has no truck with him at all. I agree with that to a certain extent. There are very many people that need to be held accountable. What's happened to the police officers, the social workers and the local councillors that all turned a blind eye to this and at some junctures tried to criminalise the victims rather than the perpetrators? That's a really legitimate question. And by the way, what can happen to them? Can they be found negligent in their duty of care? That would be a civil case, not a criminal one. My argument in favour of a public inquiry would be because all of these individual local inquiries don't have a large enough scope. Even the J inquiry, and I do agree that Starmer has a very good point when he turns around to the Tories. We've now got Tory leader Kemi Badenoch saying there should be a full public inquiry. And the riposte to that is, well, why didn't you hold one at the time? You were in government when all of this was being exposed. And second of all, why haven't you implemented any of the J recommendations? But I think there should be a wider public inquiry. And I did put this to Wes Streeting on my show on Sunday, and it's kind of gone viral because he said, oh, you know, the trouble with inquiries is they take too much time. And my response is, well, it can never take too much time to find victims for children that were gang raped. Look at the infected blood inquiry. Look at the post office inquiry. Look at Hillsborough. You have to, at some point, tell victims what went wrong and why it went wrong. At the moment, we've got different pictures of different towns, be it Rochdale, Rotherham, Oldham, Telford. We haven't got a complete picture of what appears to be an institutionalised failure of a group of some of the most vulnerable people in our society throughout a prolonged period. You know, and if I were those victims, or if I've already heard today from the father of one of those abuse victims whose daughter is still suffering years on from what happened. If I was that closely related, I would say we cannot stop until we get comprehensive answers to some of the questions that we have about this.
My point about the public inquiries is that we had the individual inquiries into the towns, the Rotherham one being the strongest of those, which came up with recommendations and did reveal how poorly these things were handled and investigated by police force, local politicians, social services, all the organisations involved. There was also the UK-wide inquiry into child sex abuse and exploitation, which has been running for a number of years and did also go into issues of grooming. That has also reported, and that reported in 2022. I think that given we have had the inquiries into the actual town's experience and we've had the UK inquiry, doesn't mean there should not be further public investigation, but it means we already have a body of evidence about what should be done. All of those inquiries have put forward recommendations which as yet have not been applied by the government. Either the Conservative government, which also turned down a public inquiry when it was in government, or the Labour government now. The Labour government have at least pledged, and we should follow up on this, Camilla, that they will put in place and agree to all the recommendations that all the inquiries have made.
But the problem with the UK inquiry, and I agree that that's okay, so the UK-wide inquiry identifies the problem, says it exists, talks about the scale of it, talks about the scale of child rape, child abuse and child exploitation. But the public inquiry is to apportion blame and have people take accountability for their actions and find people responsible for failing the public. In this case, there are people in positions of authority that have failed children who have been gang raped. So in the case of the whole point of infected blood, the post office scandal, Hillsborough, is to identify the people that failed the public, to explain how the public was failed, and to ensure that lessons are learned from what in all of those cases has been a degree of state-sponsored failure. That's what the victims are asking for. It's all very well to have inquiries opining the state of things and identifying the issue. We know what the issue is. What the victims want is for people to put their hands up and say, we got it wrong, this is how we got it wrong, and this is how we will never get it wrong again, so that future children aren't let down as horrifically as these children were.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I would just finish this point with a tweet on X by Nazir Afzal, who was the chief prosecutor who came into the northwest of England, and I think is something of a national hero for actually reopening so many of these inquiries and starting a process that did at last bring some degree of justice. He said, Hillsborough, Grenfell, Post Office, infected blood inquiry, Bloody Sunday inquiry, of all those inquiries, how many people do you think, Camilla, were, in your words, very powerful words, brought to justice?
Yeah, never. Nobody ever is.
One person, he said, Nazareth.
Most of these people are promoted up into other roles.
And we've seen from the coverage we have given to all the inquiries that have been published since we've been doing this podcast, for less than a year we've been doing this podcast together. Every time, what is our frustration? What is the Grenfell inquiry frustration? Was that the actual heads never roll. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have
I want to know who the heads are.
Yeah, that doesn't mean,
Okay,
Camilla,
I want to
you're
know
right.
who put the cladding up. I want to know who turned a blind eye when somebody said, do you know what, Grenfell might go up in flames if you're not careful. I want to know who turned around and said, do you know what, these teenage girls who hang around the chip shop, they get everything they deserve. I want to know who these people are. And if I want to know, imagine being a victim in it all.
Yeah, and then you need to make sure that there is actual justice. This is the problem with inquiries, isn't it? It doesn't, they're always frustrating because it doesn't lead to actual heads rolling or people being held to account.
That doesn't mean they shouldn't be held.